Hi, I'm Joanne Uwe. I am the founder of a festival called EA Sustain about environment, culture, and entrepreneurship. And I have actually interviewed Mark a few times and launched his book, the one we're discussing today, One Midsummer's Day, at EA Festival 2 years ago. Mark, was it last year or 2 years ago?
She's the mistress of marketing.
I can't remember. Anyway, let me, however, introduce Mark. He is a multi-award-winning author and naturalist and has published 14 books, among them 2 epic works about birds, Birds and People and Birds Britannica. He has also written about the history of British environmentalism and the extinction of indigenous peoples, not to mention 1,000 articles in Britain's leading broadsheet newspapers, including a regular country diary column in The Guardian since 1988. He's probably one of the world's, he's definitely one of the world's top ornithological writers. And this book is a case in point of that statement. But this book is actually so much more than just about birds. So now, Mark, with your incredibly prolific and eminent writing career, why did you decide to do this latest book, and how is it different from the books which preceded it?
Well, I'd always been interested in seeing connections and understanding that things were interlinked. And so for a long time, I was looking for a way of making this a more important part of the writing.
By the way,
there was a great talk. Lovely to see you all.
Wait. Mark, we forgot to background your answer to my question, which is, Mark, in brief, please describe the book just in a few paragraphs first, so that people can get a basic understanding of it.
So it's called Swifts and the Story of Life on Earth. Swifts and the Story of Life on Earth. That's its subtitle, One Midsummer's Day. And it's framed around a single day in a garden which has no geographical location, and tells the story of watching swifts for a single day, through which I try and adumbrate and bring in the connectedness of all life. That when you look at any scene, as we look at these corvids flying here, the whole of life is always implied at any one time. It's the notion that the world in a grain of sand. And this had preoccupied me before, when I wrote Crow Country, which was an earlier work. When people say to me, I've read your book, that's what they mean. I've written 14. But with this book, I wanted to find a subject. And I started a little notebook in 2008. 2008, I'm a very slow writer. And it says on the title, Blackbird. And that's because when I started, I thought I'd write about my favorite bird, which is the blackbird. And I explored how the blackbird might possibly imply all of life in a single garden, in a single scene. So that was the kind of starting place. But then I explored blackbirds, and much as I love blackbirds, I eventually incorporated swifts as well. I thought swifts would do a lot of things that blackbirds, and I'll come on to what swifts do. I thought that to have both birds and have 2 blackbirds, call it 2 blackbirds. And then eventually I realized that I could shed one of them, and the blackbird drew a short straw, and I moved on to swifts. So it was an attempt to frame around that subject. And I've gathered information about these subjects for the last 12 or 13 years. And what really partly motivated me, was I remember writing that life had been on Earth. I write articles in The Guardian, as Joanne said, and I was saying, when life began 1,000 million years ago, and I thought, well, is life begin 1,000 million years ago? When did it begin? Of course, you guys all know when it began, that it was 3.8 billion years ago. I could see it on the tip of your lips. So I thought, if I don't know this and I don't understand it, then I suspect other people will be interested in these subjects. So I began to frame a book around swifts, and the swifts are perfect for this movement between the microscopic and the macroscopic, between the individual macro lens on a single organism out towards the vast panorama. And that's because swifts are global birds, occur right across the world, 100 species. But our own swift that occurs in this country, I say our own, is the most widely distributed of all. And the thing that's most telling about the global spanning nature of swifts is the project to put little geolocators on a group of about 12 birds in Beijing, where the bird that occurs here is also present. And those birds passed during the course of the single migratory journey of 34,000 kilometers through about 37 countries, right across the whole of Africa and Asia, all the way to Namibia. And the very idea that these birds, and that is just a single journey, 34,000 return migration. Swifts can live up to 19 years. And of course, that 34,000 kilometers only records the linear distance between the birds from Beijing to one place. Their lives are literally ones of constant movement. So it gave me an opportunity to talk about the borderlessness of nature, that it has no arbitrary defined, this is our country, etc. I mean, they're only in these islands for about 12 weeks. So they have this extraordinary pan-continental journey, which I think speaks to the unitary nature of all life. But there was another aspect to them, and that is that they live in air. I mean, it is the only vertebrate life form that lives almost permanently in the atmosphere. And of course, the atmosphere, this neutral thing that is between us, through which we see one another, is nothing at all neutral about it. It is the very foundation of all terrestrial life, and was created by life. If you go to the moon or the far side of the moon, as the Chinese have done, there is no atmosphere to keep anything held down, whereas our atmosphere, created by life, begun about, I think, 2.8 billion years ago, is fundamental to all of us, and we are all here because of it. It is a collaborative process, largely a transaction between us and things that eat sunlight, that photosynthesize. So it gave me a chance to talk about something we never even consider, which is, things like the ozone layer. Well, of course we think about the ozone layer because we were destroying it. And I thought that was a very important part. So it just lent itself in so many ways. Sorry. Is that good enough?
No, I love talking with Mark because it just goes all over the place in the most fascinating and compelling, profound way. So anyway, to summarize what Mark was saying, so the book is basically through the day of a single swift, gives him...
a single observer looking at swifts.
But in theory, 24-hour cycle in the life of a swift is the vehicle by which to examine the interconnectedness of the universe, both temporally as well as spatially. And on that note, he dedicates a chapter to each one of these relationships, some of which are, actually most of which are not immediately apparent to a human observer. So to to touch upon some of them in extreme brief, just to give you an adumbration of the chapters. The chapters are, and we're not going to be able to talk about each one of them, so I'm going to ask Mark to select the one that he loves the most. But just to give you an idea that this book is not just about birds, but birds are really a vehicle for imagination. The first chapter explains the relationship between swifts and moonshine. The next chapter could be encapsulated with the expression, bacteria's been the only game in town for the last, 3 billion years?
3.8 billion years.
The third chapter, swifts are dinosaurs. The next chapter is dedicated to angiosperms and the symbiotic relationship between birds and flowers. And then I'm gonna finish in a second. And then a lot of the book is also dedicated to the concept of ecological imagination. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask Mark, tell everyone about the chapter on angiosperms and why it's accurate to say that if human beings are one thing, if you could say that we were made out of something, it would be angiosperms. So what do you mean by that?
Well, most of the agriculture that is being practiced and talked about at this festival, this extraordinary festival, which is my first visit, is rooted in human consumption of about 6 or 7 grassland species, all of which are angiosperms. But my interest in them was because plants, of course, have been on Earth for 400 million years, and then during the Cretaceous, which is the sort of final gasp of the dinosaurs. So if you've seen Jurassic Park and you see those fantastic velociraptors, actually they're not Jurassic, they're largely Cretaceous. So about 130 million years ago, the modern world started to evolve, but primarily because all the vegetation you can see behind you, in fact, everything I can see there, apart from 1 or 2 conifers, are what are called angiosperms, and they were a revolution in plant life. Essentially, they co-opted the neurological system of another group of organisms to do their sex for them, and that, of course, is insects. So I wouldn't say that what they allow you to talk about is that at the heart of all life is this profound collaboration. If we were to choose 3 sets of organisms as a way of expressing both the complexity of life and the fundamental sharing that takes place between different organisms, then you could say that they are plants, angiosperm plants, fungi, which have extraordinary, as we know from Merlin Sheldrake and all the work that's been done over the last century on mycorrhizal connections between fungi and plants. The plants at your feet all have mycorrhizal relationships with fungi, and very often are transacting nutrients between themselves. Fungi sending up minerals and nutrients and water, etc., and the plants turning sunlight into sugar and sending it down to the fungi. So that's 2 extraordinary organisms at the heart of which are angiosperms, and the third one, of course, is the connection between pollination and insects. So that is a fundamental expression of something which Darwin didn't really or was unleashed by. What we unleashed through Darwin was a sense that it was all a ruthless competition. And that isn't so. As much of it is about sharing as it is about competition. And though these symbiotic relationships between insects and plants and fungi are not necessarily a communist state where everyone is looking after the well-being of everybody else, it isn't either a ruthless competition by a set of capitalists, which is where the whole understanding of life, as Darwin had interpreted, was pigeonholed. So I think what's interesting is that fundamental process of collaboration is at the heart of what makes swifts possible. Because swifts are essentially, more than almost any other bird in this country, are made of insects. And so I thought these connections allowed me to talk about connectedness and connection. And it seems to me that this issue of connection is not just important for our understanding of our relationship with nature, but of our understanding of life itself. That we are driven forward by our educational systems to concern ourselves only with this tight little 8 degrees that we're privileged to make our money through. And yet really it is understanding the linkage across things that I think is very important. And truthfully, we are beset by crises at present, which this festival is in part created to challenge. And that is climate change, and the other thing is biological extinction, the 6th extinction. And really, the only route out of this crisis of our own making is through understanding connections between things. So the book is an attempt to tackle something that is profoundly important to me through talking about a bird that is important to me. Shall we talk about the language a little bit? Sorry,
Am I allowed to?
You are allowed, Joanne.
Okay,
I am your slave.
Wait. I was going to by the way, this is a very extemporaneous script. But on the note that also Mark was, something that you just sounded out about how, especially in the run-up to an election, we are not focusing and emphasizing enough the interconnectedness of the natural world, not only with climate change, but with each other. So on that note, I want to read a part of a paragraph of Mark's book, which was I was going to leave till the end, but it feels especially apt to read it now. And this is one of the missions of the book. No, serious. This is a very serious paragraph. Yes, Mark.
I just want to say I can't read it because share a star sign with Churchill. Both of us were blubbers, so I cry.
I'm not going to read the crying paragraph till the very end. I'm going to read the penultimate paragraph to the crying one.
Erase that from your memories.
All right. No, we're not actually Laurel and Hardy, but we're trying. Okay. We don't instill a love of our living world so that our participation within the collective living whole were viewed as the highest ideal of civilization. We have not begun to acquaint ourselves with the truth, by which I mean that we do not enshrine through the most important, heightened ritual practices of our daily lives, educational, moral, legal, economic, and spiritual, the deepest recognition of the deepest truth that we can imagine. We have not converted this storied knowledge to love. And I would say that, just segueing with your immediately previous remarks, this is very much what this book is about. It's really underscoring these connections so that we can begin to really genuinely care about them and act upon them. Okay, now, Mark, going back to the point about interconnectedness, before we get to the prose writing, I wanted to also ask you about, the book is, I was saying, not just about spatial, geographical interconnectedness, but also temporal, through billions of years. So tell us a little bit about how we all about bacteria. Do you mind talking about that?
I love to talk about bacteria. I mean, one of the interesting things is also the human imagination is trapped by its deep dependence upon sight. You know, we talk about the five senses, and of course, they're all fundamentally important, but we are predominantly a sight-driven species, diurnal primate. So for us, sight distances us from the microscopic. In fact, I strongly urge everyone to take up macro photography, because that really does enable you to attend to the extraordinary true beauty of our planet, which is usually at a very microscopic level. But one of the things the book tries to do is show you both that we are built, this whole system of life is founded on what I call a great dais of achievement by bacteria. And Joanne said, you know, bacteria are the only game in town. That's a quote from Richard Dawkins. So I tried to plumb. I'm an English graduate. I studied Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence and George Eliot, but I tried to plumb the origins of life on the planet and the origins of the Earth. And one of the most fascinating, engrossing, and tricksy subjects was about our relationship with bacteria. And you're probably thinking, bacteria? I don't like bacteria, because all bacteria speak with a northern accent. And you're probably thinking, I just want to keep bacteria at bay. Well, of course, you wouldn't be here without bacteria. Half of the oxygen you're breathing is created by phytoplankton in the sea. Bacteria created the oxygenated atmosphere that we all breathe. Bacteria living in your guts are allowing you to digest food. The milk that you poured in your tea is only produced in the 7 stomachs of cows, because the cow has co-opted bacteria to do its digestion of cellulose for it in grass. So we are absolutely and intricately connected with bacteria. And so I wanted to explore the origins of life, which of course we don't understand because we're distanced from it by nearly 4,000 million years. But it's likely to have been in a deep vent in the seabed, and likely to have been monocellular in structure before it climbed up onto the Earth. So I thought it was very important to talk about connections that we have that we never take account of until recently, actually, in agriculture. There's the beginning of these kind of extraordinary changes taking place at a festival like this are really seeing that bacteria are fundamentally important, and therefore we have to keep them alive in the soil. So in a way, speaking here is a wonderful thing for me. So there's a whole chapter, I'm most proud of it, that tries to plumb in a single 10,000 word essay or 8,000 word essay the origins of life on the planet.
Okay. Now, as you can tell, the book is chock full of facts, statistics, and science, and it's not always the easiest way to digest this kind of knowledge in an almanac style of writing. So, I mean, one of the things that's thrilling about Mark's work and the corpus of all of his work is that he delivers his insights and his observations and the science in the most beautiful, poignant prose, I would say. And so, Mark, tell us a little bit about the ecological imagination, as well as, and how you've been able to synthesize all this huge amount of learning into a palatable style that the ordinary person
can grasp.
Yeah, can grasp and then and enjoy.
Well, I mean, first of all, I try to make it accessible through a story in which I narrate the unfolding of a day and try and link different parts of my daily life to the other themes that I'm exploring. But I also attend very carefully to the prose, so I have a double focus on the living world around us and that which is present before our eyes, but also the words on the page and how they might be used to express and capture those things. And one of the things that I love is to attend to minute details in life and, as it were, slow down. I don't know if any of you have ever heard swift calls, those shrieking, screaming sounds reduced the pace slowed by about 20-fold. And the sounds of swifts become this extraordinary, unfolding, burbling, cloud-like, exquisite sound and music. And so through the prose, I tried to, and I was watching swifts last night. They move so quickly, they're very difficult to see. So I tried through the prose to, as it were, slow the swift's flight down so that you could inhabit its movements through the writing in a way that allowed you to see them more clearly. And here's an example of that writing. It describes swifts drinking. Swifts often drink at open water sites. And this is a death-defying act, literally a death-defying act. They drown if they crash. They can't get off the water's surface. But they have to angle the beak and fly simultaneously while drinking. And I watched this in enormous detail in Spain several years ago, and I wrote this couple of paragraphs about it. What I took from the Spanish encounters was the casual daring of swifts' everyday lives, when risk of death can come at any moment. The migrant birds, a mixture of common and pallid swifts, were tracking along the Mediterranean coast, but were deviating in their hundreds to the small reservoir, scouting their lines of attack, and sometimes repeating the downward surge to the surface 4 or 5 times before they had success. In the peerless lapis light of the Andalusian morning, it felt as if you could see forever. But actually picking out the split-second intricacies of their drinking operation was something I achieved only in retrospect. I photographed the swifts over and over, taking thousands of images, most of them of nothing but plain water and empty sky. What was revealed by perhaps 1 in every 200 shots was a near miraculous precision, swerving and jinking in approach to drop instantly below the surrounding chain-link fence. The swift would fall and close and almost lay its breast to the water, sometimes trailing the feet through it. Then, with wings poised in a constant, steep, upraised V, the bird sailed forth, head down, more spread widely, so that the beak ploughed the surface and cut the liquid like a blade, trailing a momentary silver furrow as it lifted skyward, with all of this complex detail being bounded by a single second. Finally, the swift, sated by the scant droplets, beetled back out into the blue of its migration route and was gone forever.
Okay, I'm glad you're not crying, Mark.
I am.
Okay.
No, I'm not.
Now, Mark, actually, I've never asked I've interviewed Mark many times. I never actually asked you, and I can't believe it, why this question. What is it about birds that has made you devote pretty much almost the whole corpus of your work to writing about them? Can you please explain their pull on you?
Yes, I mean, I've just written a book which actually says that I finished a book on seeing. And I've spent the last 20, 30 years moving outwards. I spent the last 6 months looking at mosses. I'm fascinated by fungi. So I have moved outwards towards other life forms. But the Americans have this lovely expression called the spark bird, the thing that triggered you. And I suppose birds were the spark that triggered my being captured by nature. And I wrote 2 very long books about the cultural significance of birds, in one of which I talk about why I think birds are so important as ambassadors for the rest of life. And though I am, in a sense, opposed to my former self's preoccupation with just that slice of life as the only thing that mattered, I think birds do play critical roles. First of all, they're vertebrates, so they live in ways that are familiar to ourselves. They create homes which we think loosely of as a sort of metaphor for our own dwelling places. And they're bipedal, which I think is absolutely fundamental. And so we find that birds, more than almost any other organism, have been transfigured as ways of talking about our deities. You know, if we think about Jupiter and Zeus, represented by an eagle, or Apollo by swans, or, you know, many, many gods have come in winged form. And that's because they walk on 2 feet on the earth as we do, and then they transcend everything that we are by taking off. And I think that transmission from one environment to another, their capacity to transcend every single environment, it is the most widely distributed of all vertebrate life forms, both in the troposphere and on land and on sea. I mean, to see seabirds out on their own in the middle of the ocean is truly, truly extraordinary, because they will eventually arrive on land. So I think birds allow the imagination to travel outwards across a greater span of human experience and emotions, more than any other organism. But as I say, you know, I don't want to just talk about birds, but birds are, they're ready-made symbols for the connectedness across all life. And I think that's what they've offered me, but I hasten to add that, you know, all the time I'm becoming more and more of a jack of all trades and a master of none, and I welcome that process, because I think it's understanding connection, the breadth of connection, which is transformative for us as individuals and us as a species.
Okay, Mark, I have a new, different question, another one. One of the things that Mark is seeking to counter is our natural anthropocentrism when we talk about nature in general. And this book is definitely trying to approach nature from a different point of view. But how can we adopt a different perspective when we think about and analyze and enjoy nature? Because, of course, it's important, if we want to save it, that we think from a different mindset than just one that is only human. So, Mark, how do you toggle between those 2 mindsets? Because it is true, a lot of your oeuvre is dedicated to that anthropocentric mindset, and you've been shifting. This book is a shift in your philosophy and mentality.
Yes, it's something Joanne has brought home to me, because I spent 700,000 words describing how birds could be filtered through cultural responses. Birds and People, Birds Britannica deal with how we have transmuted birds into all sorts of art forms and writing, etc. But I've now switched completely the other way around. Well, I've come to think that you know, the most extraordinary thing, all of you are wonderful people and incredible, and you're all united by one thing. The most remarkable thing you will ever do is what you're doing now, is being alive. And that life is only permissible because of your symbiotic relationship with the rest of life on the planet. But humans, particularly through Western culture, have been trapped in a notion of exceptionalism, an idea that the rest of nature is separate from them, that there's nature and us, that we are divided from it. Of course, I have news for anybody who might think that. You know, we are completely and inextricably bound up with life. And life is such an extraordinary and powerful force. If we aren't careful and attend to those relations, we will end up not being part of that life, because the one truth that I can tell you, which is optimistic, is that life is invulnerable to what we do. The structure, the bacterial monocellular structure of life is so profoundly powerful. There is nothing we can do to affect it. We will destroy ourselves through our actions if we constantly treat nature as a resource for our own utilization. But, you know, unless we start to realize we are bound in this system, we are trapped in it, we are party to it, we are trapped in the sense that we have infinite responsibility to it, and it is the most extraordinary thing you will ever be party to. So let's spend our time looking and enjoying and thrilling and enjoying something than our own species. Don't get me wrong, I love our own species. I have wonderful family and daughters, and I'm not much of a misanthrope. You can probably tell I'm a bit of a misanthrope, but you know, all of life is important, and I think it requires us to attend to its wholeness, and that's really what the book was an attempt to explore and to celebrate.
Okay. Well, Mark is undoubtedly one of the most eloquent and passionate writers, let alone nature writers, out there. And on that note, I want to actually conclude our session by reading this paragraph, which always makes Mark cry. Therefore, I am tasked with reading it to you. And it is this one.
I have read it once. I did read it once for you. Then he started
crying, probably. Yeah. Now it's my assignment to read it to you.
Yeah.
People ask me sometimes, where can we find hope? I find it problematic, not because I'm lost for suggestions. It is rather that hope is overwhelming, everywhere and without end. Open the door. Should you need to remind yourself, you are an embodiment, an inheritor of all life's 3.8 billion years of storied heritage. You are hope. You are related to everything alive in the world. You are made from the very same stardust as the mite that lives in the curve to the mandible on an Eckaton ant worker's head. Together, we are hope.
She reads it so beautifully.
Except for that one Latin word, which always gives me pause. On that note, I want to open the floor up to questions. Please.
I'll repeat the question if the mic fails, because that was what was happening at the last session. But yeah.
Okay, it's not fully formulated in my head. I'm Izzy, by the way. Hi. But I am interested in, you are trying to write in a way that decenters this kind of like
anthropocentric.
Anthropocentric
mindset.
I was like focus, but I'm like centric is focus. So I'm like, yeah. But I feel as though language is a very powerful tool to do that. But the language that we've inherited is very limiting. And I'm trying to write about our relationship to nature. And every time and how we're connected to it. But every time I do it, I say nature, and then I stumble. So you're always stumbling upon yourself. And I'm just interested in either the limitations of language and also how you've explored getting around those issues.
That's a very good question. I've just written a foreword for an academic in Edinburgh for his book about Edinburgh, and he doesn't use the word it. Try writing without having available to you the impersonal pronoun. And I don't know whether he's thrown my... I try and talk... I very often anthropomorphize. So I often talk about he or she. about the gender of birds. I try and avoid it. And you're right, you know, we have this, the very structure of language is a reflection of the nature of thought, which separates us instantly from life. So we have this fundamental pattern of subject-object, us, the world, by which we describe our experience. And to try and break that down is deeply problematic. But I think that if you're careful, I wrote a book about, I hate the word conservation. You know, we aren't conserving nature. I wrote a book about what happened in Britain in the 20th century, to write a history of what happened to our environment. And I avoid the word conservation. It's bloody difficult, and it's a very important point you raise, Lizzie, but you can do it. You just have to sort of work your way through the synonyms and actually practically pronounce at the outset that you don't want to use this language. I have friends who have invented a different kind of synonymy for other organisms that try and avoid this idea of objectifying and reductive ways of projecting meaning onto other organisms. And it sounds so false and phony. I think it's a false journey. I also wonder about trying to avoid it, but attending to the issue itself is very important. You know, life, I mean, Eliot says in the Four Quartets, you know, all languages are kind of failing, but actually implicit in the failure is something of the aspiration of the author, and I think that can carry you through to the meaning you're trying to capture. So it is true that Native Americans and many Amerindians have a completely different way of talking about those things. Whether we'll, in the West and in English, find ways of avoiding that, I'm not sure. But it's a really important question to ask yourself and a really important point to make. Yeah. There was a lady here.
Kind of related to that point, I think there's a campaign at the moment to change the Western definition of nature to include humans, and hoping that that will kind of reflect an understanding that we are not separate to nature. And I was wondering if you had any kind of other ideas which would help the wider Western society adopt that idea that we are not separate to nature.
Well, I think the critical thing is, you know, we're seeing a great movement towards we're hearing more and more about how nature is important to our mental health, to our physical health, to our well-being. We have got problems with access to green space, etc., etc. But I actually think we need to start according rights to our absence. Nature's rights to our absence. Nature's rights to silence. I'm assailed in the Peak District National Park by motorbike riding now on footpaths and things like that. And I wrote a piece in The Guardian saying, you know, I just don't think this is totally unacceptable. The damaging impact of motorbikes on these landscapes as a physical level, but the damaging nature of them at the sonic level is so extraordinary. And this endless extension of our rights to nature seems to me profoundly problematic. So although there is a great movement amongst many of my peers to state we need more rights of access, more rights to roam, well, we need to balance that with the rights of nature, for example, to persist. So I don't see environmentalism as an action about the past. We're not holding on to some conserved notion of the past. We are moving into the future with the rights of those organisms to persist in these islands. What about extending legal rights to the idea that nature should be as rich for our grandchildren as it is today? Well, of course, it needs to be richer because we trashed it so badly. And that's what this festival is attending to, is those challenges which are breaking down the very basics of agriculture. So the cherries are doing something incredibly exciting for me. So I think it's wrong to set it as rights because it is truthfully about symbiotic collaboration. It isn't as if we're extending rights to insects because we're some sort of socialist regime. Insects provide every third mouthful you put in your mouth. The value of pollination services to the planet is calculated, which is itself an abandonment of the issue that, we shouldn't be talking about it like this, but in ecosystem services speak, it's worth $570 billion. That's what insects do for you. And it seems that we've got to get beyond just econometric measures of the importance of nature to ascribe it importance because it's part of the family.
Right. Can I just say? Yeah, I think that, I just want to say that capitalist systems are built on the idea of P&Ls being, all the public goods don't get factored in, all the negative externalities don't get factored in. And so actually there's a report called the Dasgupta report, actually, which, it describes a lot of this problem, and some of the ways to address it are clearly that the entire way that we think of economic systems needs to be reconsidered to take into account this one-way extractive process which depletes the natural environment. Also, I wanted to make a comment about how do you actually, to the first question. She's about changing the mindset. There's actually an incredible artwork by an artist named Alexandra Daisy Greenberg, which is called Pollinator Pathmaker, which is actually devised from the standpoint of an insect and how it actually goes about pollination. And I think this I don't know if this sounds crazy, Mark, but have you ever thought about writing a work from the standpoint of an animal or an insect or a bird? That sounds like kind of a...
No.
But this is actually, you should check that out. It's publicly available.
Yeah.
It's a very acclaimed interactive online artwork. And I think that actually is probably a window into the answer to that question partly.
Yes. There are some fantastic inhabitings of animals' lives by Western writers. Henry Williamson's Sailor the Salmon, Talk of the Otter, but also The Last of the Curlews by Fred Bodsworth is probably the best bird one that I know. But Charles Foster, my buddy, a fantastic writer on nature, one of the most ambitious and damn right clever. I hate him. But he wrote a book, Cry of the Wilderness, or Cry of the Wild, I think it's called, where he imagines himself as a mayfly. I don't think it's necessarily the most successful inhabiting of a mayfly. I don't really know what kind of emotional worlds mayflies have, but it is bloody good, and I love it for its adventurousness. And as I say, we forgive people because we know that we can't, as it were, be that insect or that whale or whatever, but the trying of it there's something profoundly important in failing well at that process. So I think, one of the things that I would say just more broadly and really ask Joanne, because Joanne is a fantastic student of modern art, it seems to me a major failing that art isn't really becoming more completely concerned, shedding its kind of postmodern preoccupations with the medium and the kind of relativism of life, and starting to attend to our relationship with nature, or to attend to our relatedness to nature.
Actually, why don't you mention E.A. Sustain?
Yes, okay. Well, Joanne is, as you know, is a fantastic entrepreneur and marketeer. Both for other people, but also for her own work. And she's created 2 extraordinary festivals in East Anglia, in Essex and Suffolk, called EA Sustain and EA Festival, where there are a couple of events coming up shortly, one at the Tate Modern, about these subjects.
Yes.
She pays me for saying that.
Well, no, I asked Mark to segue into that because I think that we also have to consider that everything is actually all of a piece.
Mm-hmm.
So the questions that are being posed about, how are we actually going to how are we going to actually shift our subjectivity so that it becomes much more nature-centric? I think that art and culture are at the center of that question, of that interrogation, basically, and that festival that I founded called EA Sustain is very, very much about that.
Focused on that.
So it's not just about agriculture, nature per se, but also
about art.
How do we actually change? How do we shift our mindset so that it's less anthropocentric?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, here.
It was just to follow on from this piece about pronouns and
yes.
making yourself feel part of nature. and it's covered very well in the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Yes.
And she spends a whole chapter talking about how the Potawatomi people, they describe themselves as it, actually.
Describe
themselves as it.
Yes.
So we are it.
Yes.
So we don't separate ourselves.
No.
And it's fascinating. So it's about the reciprocity between nature and people and how we are intricately.
Yes, that's very interesting. Instead of worrying about it being just used as an objectifying pronoun, but to start calling ourselves it. Try it. Try writing a piece where it's tricky, because you're trapped in the system by which you're trying to extricate yourself, and it is problematic. But I've heard that I've read her book Gathering Moss, but I haven't read the one Braiding Sweetgrass. Yeah.
There's a question over there.
Yes.
I was just wondering whether you had thought about writing for children. I'm just thinking about like the Horrible Histories series of books and the TV series and the songs that my children remember, even though they're not massively into history, and the power of that, and whether that's something you've considered.
I did start writing when I was a younger parent. I invented this kind of spirit of nature called Bogle Dandy, and my children used to say, "Daddy, tell us a Bogle Dandy story." And so, as we were driving home from going to look at nature, I'd have to invent a story in which, strangely enough, there were two young girls always involved. So I wrote these. I extemporized these stories for the children. I did try and write it up, but it was not a great success. So far, I've not got there, but I have tried. It's bloody difficult, I'm trying to break out into fiction a little bit more. And the latest book, I'll let you into a secret. I didn't spend the whole day looking at swifts. I invented a composite portrait of my relationships and looking, etc., out of which I then drew the story. So it is the closest I've got to fiction so far, but I haven't tried children's fiction.
Okay, I'm going to ask Mark a question. Mark, tell us about the book you're writing now. What are you working on?
Yes, well, I've been writing a book which is called On Seeing, Nature, and it's about the fallacy that observation is a neutral action. It is, in fact, and can be the most creative and important act that you will ever do in your life. So I've written this essay, which my work seems to be taking longer and longer. I wrote this 9,000-word essay, which has taken me about 10 months. I'm very slow at writing. Anyway, it's about how seeing can become an interrogation of life, and really drinking in what you see with your eyes, this incredible world of which we are a part, can be both a terrible trap, of course, the patterns of sight and the way in which the cerebral cortex or the visual cortex processes sight information is incredibly entrapping and restricts us to see only what we have already seen. And it's a diagnose a moment in my own life where I was pursuing this self-perpetuating, not seeing the world as it truly is. And how did I break out of the shackles of seeing only birds and only processing bird information, when in fact I was missing most of the information of life. So this book is not yet published, but I have it possibly coming out shortly. But I'm really, really pleased with this one essay, because I think we so often think that seeing the world is somehow a neutral, unloaded process, when in fact it is. You can remake the world for yourself through attending to what is before you, and it's about this subject, but also examples of my own writing about seeing life and seeing nature.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Scanning the floor.
My question is focused on how some of your writing, and I'm thinking of Our Home in particular here, is kind of marked by its great sadness, and there's some passages that are very memorable. So my question really is, do you still kind of feel that deep melancholy, or do you have more reasons to be optimistic?
Yes, Our Place is a book, as you describe. I was, yes, full of, well, it's basically a transcript of how we became one of the most denatured countries on earth. So it is full of a kind of sorrow. Well, I treat it in two ways. First of all, I have two versions of hope, one of them defined by Seamus Heaney, which is that hope is not wishing things will turn out well, but a recognition that there's important work to do. Hope is not a wishing that things will turn out well, but a recognition that there's important work to do, more or less. And I think that's important. So I have a kind of hope regardless of everything. But I also have a new hope, particularly in this country, because I do see, I mean, particularly I was talking to Paul Cherry, the founder of this festival, and John Cherry and his brother have created something truly exceptional. And I am filled with optimism by what I see here. There's a long journey to make, but there are some extraordinary initiatives. So I am very hopeful that we can turn this around. And, you know, the usual cliche is the day is darkest, the night is darkest just before dawn. Well, we're at that place. We are at dawn. And if we're not at dawn, it's going to get very dark because the sun won't reappear. But I am hopeful. I am deeply hopeful. I'm hopeful because of this thing that I talk about, that at the moment I've just discovered 10 miles from where I live, the most orchids I have ever found anywhere in Britain. And, you know, the moment you see something like that, I'm filled with a sense of connection and profound relationship with these organisms. So I'm working on another book, which is much more positive and can map out ways to a new future. So it's a kind of Our Place. My last book was called Our Place, and my wife, from whom I get most of my best ideas, decided it should be called Not Our Place. By which I mean, our place, I was asking, what is our place in the whole frame of life? Not Our Place is about that this isn't ours. You know, we're renting it for a short while. We aren't owners of this stuff. As the Native Americans know, they're party to it. So I'm hoping that I'll get a book which won't depress you quite as much as the last one.
Oh, I want to add a little postscript to answer your question. I think that also, if you're at Groundswell, you already have hope.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is what this is about. It's about
Yes.
the power of the individual and propagating knowledge by transmitting it through the events that are held here. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I think Mark is going to write, 10 more books, Mark? That's a sign of hope. On that note,
there was one last question.
Oh, okay, fine.
We've got time for just one last question. Who has a T-shirt which says worms? Now, this is a woman after my own heart.
This is really the last question.
Yeah.
Thank you. It felt like quite a nice sentiment to end it on. So, but it's a similar sentiment, my first question, and it sounds like a very moving book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But I was wondering if there's any parts in the research process while you were writing that you found either particularly challenging or particularly that you most enjoyed and found most inspiring and hopeful.
Researching for the last book that I've done. Yeah. Yes, I did. I mean, I found, I mean, research, of course, is always great because you haven't formulated the failed attempt to express it all. So you're simply absorbed in the very positive idea of how can you take this and retransmute it. But I did find the whole journey of our play, of One Midsummer's Day, probably the most rewarding of all the books. The daunting prospect was to try and compress it all into a single synthesized, simple story, to make it accessible to the reader. And so that was a real challenge. As I say, the chapter I found most engrossing was in some ways the one furthest from, which was the origins of monocellular life. But all of the research, truthfully, was, it's been the most fulfilling book to have written, I think. Birds and People is 440,000 words long and nearly killed me. I'm very proud of that. But this one, it's closest to what I want to say. But I'm very, very pleased with this new book, as all authors are. And when they're given an opportunity to plug it, they will always shamelessly
it coming
take
out,
it.
Mark? When's it coming out?
Well, I don't know. It's with my editor and my agent, but
Okay.
we live in hope. Anyway, thank you. Joe said when we first got here that there might be nobody in the auditorium, but I am thrilled that you've all come from the Farming Festival to listen to this talk. But a big thanks to Joanne, who is fantastic at this stuff. Thank you very much.